Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Hannah Tyler. In this week's episode, we have a newsy episode focused on the latest in immigration, discussing the new Bipartisan Border Technology Caucus in Congress, new border numbers and the new groups of people we're seeing at the border, and the status of Title 42. All that after the break, so stick around. Welcome back. For this week, we'll get a lot of download on the latest immigration news from our regular guest, Theresa Cardinal Brown, Managing Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. You can follow Theresa on Twitter at BPC_T_Brown. Welcome, Theresa.
And welcome to you, Hannah. Glad to have you doing this with me today.
Yeah, glad to be doing it. Okay, let's start at the border. Encounters at the border were up 7% in February from January, with encounters of single adults specifically up 11.5%. We saw a number of interesting changes in the nationalities encountered this month. The number of Colombians encountered was nearly double the number encountered last month. Number of Cubans was up 107%. The number of Venezuelans encountered dropped precipitously, in part because Mexico instated visa restrictions for Venezuelans, Brazilians, and Ecuadorians on January 21st, 2022, requiring them to obtain a visa before entering the country. So, Theresa, what do you make of the changed demographics at the border? In other words, the increase of single adults and the increase in numbers in general? Is it unusual for numbers at the border to be increasing at this time of year?
So it's hard to say usual anymore. I think for many, many years at the border, there was definite seasonality. We could definitely see drop-offs in the depths of winter, pick up in the spring, drop off again in the height of summer, pick up again in the fall. In the last several years, those patterns have just been completely upended. And I think it's a sign of the difference in the type of population that's coming. It's not seasonal migration. It's not migrants coming for specific types of work. It is a different set of migrants coming for various different reasons. And so the time of the year is less relevant to them in their desire to come to the United States. So yes, ordinarily we wouldn't necessarily see an uptick between January and February, but we have this year and we've seen it last year and a couple years before. The trend that we used to see about seasonality, I think we can't depend on that anymore. We can't even call it counter-cyclical because there's no cycle anymore. What's more relevant, and we're seeing this, is what other countries are doing that enable or discourage travelers from making their way through those countries to our border. Certainly what's happening in the rest of the world that's driving migration from those places. I think that is having much more of an impact than the weather changes along the border. And you mentioned the uptick in single adults. I think that is a continuing ongoing result of Title 42. So the number one group that Title 42 still applies to is single adults encountered at the border, and particularly single adult Mexicans that are returned across the border generally within a matter of hours after they're first encountered with no immigration consequences. So we've talked about this before. The opportunity cost for them of repeat tries is very low, and we're seeing continuing increased levels of recidivism. In other words, people encountered multiple times in a year. So I think that trend plus, as I said, the circumstance of families and children and people from large parts of the hemisphere and around the world coming looking for asylum are things that have taken that traditional seasonal trend off the table for now.
Like we were talking about before a little bit, the visa-free travel to Mexico is clearly having an impact on numbers at the border. Do you expect, now that Mexico has instated visa restrictions for Venezuela, Brazil, and Ecuador, and we've seen numbers from those countries drop at the border, that more visa restrictions will follow as numbers change and flows change?
Yeah. So in particular, we should note that the Colombians who don't currently have a visa restriction in Mexico, my guess is that the United States, much like these other countries, will be pressuring Mexico to instill a visa requirement for Colombians. And I would say that it will depress the numbers of people we see at the border for a time until they find alternate methods or the smugglers that are aiding them find alternate pathways north. So, for example, we have seen that with the Cubans. Cubans previously did not require a visa to go to Mexico. We saw large numbers of Cubans arriving at the border. Mexico imposed a visa requirement on Cubans. They went down. We're starting to see increases there again, as you mentioned, in part because Nicaragua still has visa-free travel. So now they're going to Nicaragua and then making their way north from there. So, again, it's not a permanent, diminishment of the migration that we're seeing. It's a delay. It's a restructuring. And, as long as there are people that are desperate to get here, they manage to find ways.
What would visa restrictions from Mexico on other Central American countries mean? And does our increased reliance on Mexico as a migration management partner or a buffer country have an impact on our relationship with them?
Well, to take the second part of that question, we had a conversation with Arturo Saracan a few weeks ago, and I think he did note how salient the immigration issue is between the United States and Mexico in our bilateral relationship right now. We know that, for example, Secretary Mayorkas was in Mexico City this just last week, trying to work with Mexico. He's also visiting Costa Rica, and they announced a migration management agreement of some kind. We're not entirely sure of the details there with Costa Rica. I think the Biden administration is eagerly seeking not just Mexico's help with managing migration flow, but the entire hemisphere. He mentioned that the upcoming Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles in June, he would like to be able to announce some sort of hemispheric or regional migration agreement to manage this. So I think part of that agreement will definitely include alignment of visa requirements between and among countries to try to at least manage migration routes through those countries. It may also include expansion of asylum or protection regimes in other countries, such as Mexico or Costa Rica, where migrants might be able to find protection without making their way through the United States. My guess is it will also include additional mechanisms at, I won't say border security, but border management. In many cases, the checking of documents and of people crossing land borders throughout the continent is not very stringent, and that enables irregular migration. The visa requirement, I think, has the most impact, frankly, on those who are able to afford flights into and out of the country. I think for those that are of means and are able to fly direct without having to get a visa, that is a significant enabler and indicator of migration that we're going to see at the border.
We're turning now to another population that we're seeing in increasing numbers at the border, Ukrainians and Russians. Though we have yet to see an increase in Russians and Ukrainians at the border in official data, from anecdotal reports, it seems that more people from these countries are arriving in Mexico and attempting to cross into the US. Russians have visa-free travel to Mexico, while Ukrainians do not. Do you think that the Biden administration will act to allow these nationalities to seek asylum in the U.S. now that they're arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border? And do you think that their arrival at the border will put pressure on the Biden administration to act?
So just today, as we are recording this on Thursday, the 17th of March, we know that Secretary Mayorkas has told the press that CBP has given direction to their officers at ports of entry that Ukrainians can be exempted from Title 42 restrictions. That means they can be allowed into the country to apply for parole or to go through a formal immigration court hearing. He also noted that they might be eligible for humanitarian parole, which would give them work authorization and permission to stay in the United States for a period of time. Now, how much of that exercise of discretion we will see at the borders remains to be seen. It applied only at the ports of entry, not anybody encountered between, and it only applied to Ukrainians, not Russians. The few instances that we've seen so far of Ukrainian families at the border trying to come in, usually to reunite with families in the United States, seems to have had some pressure on the Biden administration. We understand that Vice President Harris, when she was in Poland, was urged by the Polish government to allow Ukrainians with family in the United States to find a way to go to the United States to relieve pressure on Europe. We have called for that as well, expansion of humanitarian parole. So I think it's a step in the right direction, but I think it probably will need to have a little bit more teeth to it, as well as opening of avenues for applying for humanitarian parole for Ukrainians that aren't able to make it all the way to the border to the United States. I think the other issue with Russians, yes, they have visa-free travel to Mexico, but we're not seeing Russians at the border in the same way. And I think that's not necessarily the right way to view it. My belief certainly is that many Russians who are trying to come to the United States right now may be Russians who are not in agreement with the actions of Putin and the Kremlin in invading Ukraine and would be subject to persecution if they were anti-war protesters or people that have political opposition to Putin. So they might very well be eligible for asylum in the United States. So I'm not necessarily sure that we should have such a blanket distinction between Ukrainians and Russians who might be seeking asylum. But as of right now, Russians have not been granted that same exercise of discretion that Ukrainians have.
Right. So you talked about this a little bit in your last answer, but you also published an op-ed in The Hill this week explaining how the U.S. can step up its efforts to aid Europe with the refugee crisis. So what other options are available to the Biden administration to assist Ukrainian refugees besides the ones that you've already listed?
Sure. So the allowing Ukrainians with family members in the United States to apply for parole or visas at embassies and consulates in Europe to expedite or prioritize those cases would be helpful. There's already talk, although we haven't seen official reporting of this yet, of prioritizing Ukrainians in the refugee queues. We did that with Afghan refugees prior to the evacuation from Afghanistan. We could create that priority in the refugee system for Ukrainians. However, that still requires them to get in the process. One way that it can be expedited is rather than requiring them to go through the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to get registered before being referred to the US, they would be allowed to either directly apply or have US sponsors help them through that process. So that's one thing that we could do. Another thing, obviously, is expand the grant of humanitarian parole, allow more Ukrainians to apply for that based on criteria, particularly if there's family in the United States. And help Europe with its refugee issues right now via resources and money and whatever other things that we can spare to help them with the humanitarian needs that they have there. We don't know how many Ukrainians will want to come to the United States. The belief now is that the vast majority will want to stay in Europe. They have more ties to Europe than they do to the United States, but there's not a small Ukrainian American community in the United States. And particularly places that have a lot of Ukrainian Americans are actively looking to see how they can help Ukrainians get here where they feel like they will have safety and support. So there are different ways that the administration could act to try to help this. Certainly for those that show up at the border, that's one option. But providing ways for Ukrainians that aren't able to make it all the way to our borders is another.
Would the prioritization of Ukrainians in the refugee process have knock-on effects on other populations?
Unfortunately, yes. And we saw that with the arrival of the Afghan evacuees, that the diversion, if you will, of many asylum officers to processing humanitarian parole claims of the Afghans that were on the military bases resulted in additional backlogs of affirmative asylum cases that were already pending at the agency. It isn't like there's a surge capacity or an excess capacity in the refugee system right now. It is at diminished capacity from where it was prior to the Trump administration, even in the first 2 years of the Trump administration. That having been said, we still have more capacity in our system than just about any other country in the world. And we can search resources as needed. If this is the priority that the administration makes it, if it makes a priority, then yes, that will happen. But right now it would be to the detriment of others in line unless we do find ways to hire more people into government, to provide more support for UNHCR and the other NGOs that are involved in the refugee program.
Okay, well, let's move on to another story from the border. Title 42, the pandemic-era policy that allows the administration to turn people away at the border, is also reportedly affecting Ukrainians and their ability to seek asylum in the United States, and it's been affecting other migrants' ability to do the same a long time before this. There are reports now that the Biden administration and DHS are preparing for a rollback of the policy, either by the administration ending it or because of a court order. and also reports that DHS and other agencies have set up a Southwest Border Coordination Center, an SBCC, which is described as an interagency war room in charge of coordinating an interagency response by Axios. Biden administration officials reportedly fear a, quote, mass migration event if the policy ends. So we talked about this a little bit in the last section, but Theresa, do you think that the policy's effect on Ukrainians and Mayorkas's decision now that, or Mayorkas's statement that Ukrainians can be exempted, other people with special circumstances can be exempted, and the decision on March 11th to no longer apply Title 42 to unaccompanied minors will put pressure on the Biden administration and the CDC to roll back the policy for good?
I think they've been experiencing a lot of pressure over the last year, increasing pressure to roll back Title 42. And I think we can't separate this from the two court decisions that came down a week or so ago. The DC District Court of Appeals said that Title 42 could not be used to expel families without giving them a chance to ask for protection if they feared torture or persecution in their home country. So that would definitely impact how families are treated under the Title 42 circumstance. It essentially means they would have to be interviewed before they could be expelled back to their countries. That process is not likely to be significantly different from the procedure that would be implemented if somebody was put in expedited removal. And if certainly they met that requirement, then they would be allowed to pursue relief through immigration court. So that has one impact. On the flip side is the Texas court decision that said that unaccompanied minors could not be exempt categorically from Title 42. That decision was based on the Administrative Procedure Act, that the government did not fully consider all of the ramifications of excluding minors from Title 42. The response of the Biden administration was, rather than appeal that decision, they issued a new CDC order that excluded unaccompanied minors. So now they're no longer covered under Title 42 at all. It remains to be seen if the judge in Texas will find that sufficient or if that will come down as all. But I think this continued uncertainty, and now, of course, the arrival of Ukrainians for whom many people have sympathy at the border, increased pressure from advocates to say that Title 42 needs to come down. And frankly, that decision in DC, the judge was pretty clear that it seemed that the public health rationale for this seemed to be diminishing by the day as the country is opening up. So I do think that one way or the other, this is going to be ended soon. If I were the administration, I would want to end it on our own terms and be able to have alternative processes in place. And I think that's what this Southern Border Coordination Center is supposed to do. Now, what exactly they're going to do, I can't say. Coordination amongst all the agencies that would be engaged if we did take down Title 42 and suddenly have to process the, 50 or 60,000 additional cases a month that would come under this. That's approximately the number of people who have been expelled under Title 42 each of the last several months. Then, certainly capacity and capability. Do we have structures? We might need soft-sided facilities again. Do we have enough personnel to manage the case processing once people are brought to those centers? There was supposedly a call from the DHS secretary for volunteers, once again, to go down to the U.S.-Mexico border and help with that back-end processing of people. So that certainly indicates that they are expecting an increase. I find that actually good. I'm happy to see the administration trying to think ahead of what might be coming rather than being completely responsive after the fact to the people who have already arrived. We have not seen a long track record under this administration, or frankly under prior administrations, of being ahead of that curve and having systems and procedures and support in place before things reach a crisis level. So I'm actually glad to see that they're moving in that direction.
How do you think that the administration can better prepare for the end of Title 42 past the actions that they have been taking, the ones that you described? Are there other things that they might do that would better prepare them for the policy coming down?
So this is still probably set up as a temporary response rather than any sort of long-term change at the border. And I think we need to consider that we are in the need of a long-term change in terms of facilities, processing capability, and procedures for how we address asylum seekers at the border and people who generally are not coming directly from Mexico. And that's going to mean an investment in new types of facilities along the border, maybe in expanding our asylum processing capability. You know, the administration has this regulation that they keep talking about becoming final anytime that would allow asylum officers to actually adjudicate asylum claims for people arriving at the border rather than sending them all to immigration court. That will help, but only so long as we have enough asylum adjudicators to do that. And as I mentioned, it's not like we have surge capacity in the system. We don't have excess capacity. It's not being used right now. So where is that going to come from? We need, as quickly as possible, to have a major push to hire and bring on board more adjudicative capacity in our asylum and immigration court system. Otherwise, we're just sort of processing people into a growing backlog, and that is not helping anything at all. So I think that, again, this coordination center is good. It's a good emergency response measure. It is, good practice to do that. You want all the agencies involved in one place so that you can coordinate as quickly as possible. But we do need to be thinking what we need to change in the longer term.
And do you think that a hemispheric migration agreement like the one that the Biden administration is reportedly pursuing might be part of that solution?
It's definitely part of that solution. I mean, the benefits of such an agreement, if it's agreed upon and things are put in place, is that instead of all of the migrants coming to the US-Mexico border and being part of our asylum process, we might have other countries receiving more and more migrants willing to stay in other countries so that not everybody's coming here. We probably still will have the majority, but maybe we'll have fewer that decide it's worth making the trek all the way to the United States when they can find safety or security and support from governments closer to where they come from. So it's really about managing the migration flows through the hemisphere. It's not going to completely obviate our need to address our own systems, because I think there will still be probably the largest number that will come here. Again, we still have the greatest capacity. We should help these other countries build up their capacities, but I think we can't delude ourselves that it will somehow mean that nobody's coming anymore.
Ending what's been a border-focused podcast, we're turning to the announcement that on March 10th, a Bipartisan Border Technology Caucus formed in the House of Representatives, made up of Representatives Tony Gonzalez, a Republican from Texas, Chuck Fleischmann, a Republican from Tennessee, Tim Ryan, a Democrat from Ohio, and Vicente Gonzalez, a Democrat from Texas. According to their members, they intend to bring together a coalition of lawmakers from across the political spectrum to ensure the United States is on the cutting edge of technological advancements. Theresa, how is this group different from other caucuses or groups that have looked at the border in Congress?
So this is kind of interesting from my perspective, because there is a Congressional Border Caucus that is, I think, entirely made up of Republicans. And it has been advocating for very strong border security measures. They were proponents of building the wall. They are proponents of Remain in Mexico, the Migrant Protection Protocols, and Title 42. The fact that this is a bipartisan group, that they are focused on border security technology, which is an area with more bipartisan support in Congress, means that they're trying to form an alternative. And it's an alternative that takes border security seriously, but looks at it from a different frame. And I think one of the issues in sort of getting Congress to move forward on immigration, anything, is this sort of debate that's been ongoing between border security and legalization. And for many Democrats, the idea of talking about border security is very difficult for them. For whatever reason, they talk about how much border security has already been put in place, how the existing border security measures have civil rights impacts on the border, that these harsh measures are negatively applying to asylum seekers, and even there's skepticism of border surveillance technologies as being instituting essentially a surveillance state for people who live along the border. These are not, I think, completely irrational concerns, The issue, though, is that they haven't articulated what they are behind when it comes to border security. And so I think seeing a bipartisan group like this that's obviously focused on border technology, but has the ability to craft what can be a bipartisan narrative around what a bipartisan vision of border security might look like, I think is important. I think we need to have another type of conversation happening that's not just antithetical to Border Patrol and building a wall, technology and surveillance, or, says that we have to do all of that and get rid of asylum and everything else. Like, this is hopefully a place where some sort of compromise or consensus-based policy, something that can appeal to both Republicans and Democrats, could form and could help move that debate a little bit more forward.
In that vein, do you think that a caucus like this is sort of a way in towards moving bipartisan consensus on immigration in general forward?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know how many other than the 4 founding members, how many others will join. It probably will take more than 4 people to make this a really potent or effective caucus. It's interesting. These are moderate members, moderate Republicans, moderate Democrats, 2 who have districts along the border in Texas. I think that it's a start. And you got to start someplace. And, we work at the Bipartisan Policy Center. So I'm happy to see anything that is a truly bipartisan effort at addressing these issues. And, I hope that, we can work with them and others will work with them to try to support defining what that vision looks like at the border. And if that can help kind of unstick this debate, and allow some legislative options to move forward, I think that's all to the better.
So what do you think that vision might look like, and what kind of border technologies do you think that this coalition might focus on?
Unclear. I mean, there's been a lot of different kind of technology discussions and a lot of different technologies that have been tried at the border. The idea of a quote unquote virtual wall has been around, frankly, since the George W. Bush administration. So it's not a new idea that we would deploy technologies both for what they call situational awareness along the border, which is a surveillance type that would help Border Patrol know when somebody or something has crossed the border that represents somebody that they have to encounter and address, a threat that they might need to address. But I hope also it deals with ports of entry. There's a lot of conversation, particularly among Republicans right now, about the increase in fentanyl overdoses and the scourge of fentanyl in the United States, and blaming that on much of it coming from Mexico, which is not untrue. The issue there is that almost all of that, and frankly, almost all illicit drugs that come from Mexico are coming through the ports of entry. There's a lot fewer or a lot smaller numbers that are coming between. There's many reasons for that, and it's not saying that there's nothing coming across the border. We've heard reports from Border Patrol of drones that are flying and dropping packages. So, but in terms of bulk and volume, much more is encountered at the ports of entry than between the ports of entry, because the methods of delivering it are larger and more available. And for drug cartels that are business organizations, although criminal business organizations in an illegal trade, they can see much greater profit for the risk of putting larger quantities through ports of entry and trying to get them through that way than the smaller quantities they might be able to deliver between the ports of entry. So for right now, at least, that's their primary focus. So I would hope that the caucus would look at the ports of entry as well as what we might look at between the ports of entry as well.
Great. Well, I think that's all the questions that I have for this week. We've gone over a lot of news, so thanks for joining me, and we will see you in 2 weeks. And that's it for our show this week. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. I'm Hannah Tyler. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Hannah Tyler, Theresa Cardinal Brown, and Hanadi Jordan. Ethan Plotkin produces and edits our show. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you in 2 weeks.